Now, I think we have Elliot Harman coming up next. We have him. Elliot Harman, he is the senior activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And we're talking about something that I think people are going to be hearing a lot more of. Right now, Donald Trump has said that he will not sign the defense authorization bill unless Section 230 is struck from the Digital Millennium Act. And so I think we're going to hear a lot more about this going forward, regardless of who controls the Senate, frankly, starting in January. Elliot, welcome to the program. Thanks for coming. Tell us what Section 230 is and when was it created?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on, Sam. I'm really excited to be here. Section 230, there's actually a little bit of a misconception. It was passed as part of the CDA, the Communications Decency Act, in 1996, and not the DMCA, though it's sometimes worth talking about both laws together. Section 230, to put it just very succinctly, it says that if you go on the internet and you say something unlawful, you're the one who should be held responsible. You're the one who should be liable, not the website where you said it and not any other party. There has been a bit of a misconception. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Unlawful. What constitutes something unlawful? I mean, so something if I libel in writing or I slander somebody on on this program, let's say, what else would constitute unlawful?
Right. You're right on the first one, that many of the cases that involve Section 230 are libel or defamation cases. There's also certainly material related to obscenity laws, relating to sex work, and we can have a whole discussion about the one time that Congress changed Section 230 and put sex workers in a great deal of danger. There are, lots of laws that implicate speech in one way or another. And again, what Section 230 says, or what it does, is it says that you are the one responsible for those posts. You're the one who will be held liable in court, not the app that you use to post it, not the website where you posted it. One of the ways that there's been so much misinformation, and that Trump himself has been the source of a lot of that misinformation, is saying that Section 230 is some kind of handout to big tech or to Silicon Valley. Section 230 protects all of us. If you've ever forwarded an email, if a court decides that email is defamatory, then Section 230 says that you can't be held liable for it.
I see. Okay. So, but it has been a gift to big tech in some respects, right? I mean, it's not a unilateral one. And at the time that it was developed, it wasn't necessarily, it has been one of the mechanisms that has allowed these platforms to grow. And so let's talk about how we deal with some of the problems that we have with these platforms, right? And we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about Google, to some extent, we're talking about Amazon and all their subsidiary companies. And what, from your perspective, what do people see as the problem?
It's interesting. There's been kind of these two parallel discourses going on about Section 230. On the one hand, you have primarily people on the right, saying that the problem is that Twitter and Facebook are censoring people, and in particular this idea that they're primarily censoring conservatives, which, as far as I can tell, is a claim without a whole lot of evidence to back it up, and that the platforms need to be quote unquote neutral public forums. There's even this myth that somehow you need to be a neutral public forum, or you need to be unbiased in order to have Section 230 protections, and that's not true. At the very same time, there's this other discourse that I'd say is kind of primarily people on the left saying that platforms aren't doing enough to remove disinformation, to remove hate speech, and saying that Section 230 should be changed somehow to say that you only get Section 230 protections if you meet these certain criteria for removing that kind of problematic material. The irony is that on both sides, there's this little nugget of truth that it is a genuine problem that there are only, depending how you count, 4 or 5 companies that control so much of speech on the internet, such that the moderation decisions that one of them makes will have massive reverberations in terms of who's allowed to speak and who's allowed to organize online and what messages get out there. That's a genuine problem. Unfortunately, people have latched on to 230 as the vehicle to use to address that problem, when at least all of the evidence that we have so far shows that undermining 230 or completely repealing 230 as Trump claims to want, will give the big tech companies more power. I mentioned a second ago, Sesta Foster.
I want to walk through this because this is important for people to understand. The argument that that, let's say you hear from the conservatives, like, I've been shadow banned, or I'm not allowed to find out the real truth of the server in Germany that has been, taken by an elite squad of American military personnel, and they're going to deliver it to Governor Kemp in Georgia. I can't say that as if it was, something, on my Facebook thing, that channel that gave me that information is no longer, operating. The argument there is that these platforms have become so important and integral to our daily lives that they are essentially functioning like a utility, like the electric company, like the idea of phone lines. And therefore, they cannot make those distinctions any more than, the phone company can decide what I say on the phone to somebody else or in a conference call or something to that effect. That is one of the issue there for that type of censorship. And then the other, of course, is you're a public utility. You have a responsibility to differentiate between these things in the same way that, like, the FCC regulates broadcast television and says, like, you can't, there's certain limitations as to what you can do here. Some people argue that we should nationalize these platforms, which I think is very problematic, because then you have the government in there deciding, what these standards are. And that's very complicated. I certainly wouldn't want Donald Trump's FCC to be in charge of whatever agency it would be as to what, Twitter can put out there. So then the question is, like, how do we deal with this stuff? And your argument is that to focus on 230 is looking at the wrong thing. Well, so what would happen if we got rid of 230 in terms of these things?
It's funny. There's this idea that's developed that if we got rid of Section 230, then suddenly platforms would become a lot more hands-off in their moderation decisions. It's a little bit hard to tell what would happen because all of these companies that we're talking about were founded well after 230 passed. But from the evidence that we have, at least thus far, the opposite would happen. They would need to become much more restrictive in what they allow online and in, frankly, who they allow online. All of a sudden, like, if somebody's going to write on Twitter, I mean, I guess I'm a public figure, but if someone was going to write something like, boy, I watched the Majority Report today, and that Elliot Harman, he looks like a blankety blank, and he accused you of something. You could sue whoever, on that platform, theoretically, in which someone wrote that, right? I mean, right. And it's important to. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, well, go ahead.
And it's important to think about that from the perspective of the platforms. The question for them would not be. Would we be able to fight off a defamation suit in court? The question would be, will that defamation suit happen in the first place? What 230 essentially does is it gives platforms and other kind of intermediaries too flexibilities to sort of define their own moderation policies. And I think personally it's a good thing for the internet to have some platforms that are more restrictive and some that are more hands-off. I think it's good to have that multiplicity of choices. But when platforms are essentially forced to put their thumb on the scale, forced to put anything that is in a gray area into the delete pile, who's affected by that is not uniform across everyone. The people who would be removed from the discussion first would be marginalized voices.
Of course, that's always the case in any dynamic, right? I mean, it's always the people with the least amount of political or economic power who are going to be the first, who are going to lose in that situation. All right, well, so let me bounce this off you. So, I mean, and I think, we talk a lot about antitrust on this program, and if the solution is not to be able to like effectively moderate these things or to come up with the perfect special sauce as to what things should be allowed and what not, the only other solution is to make these platforms not as so crucial to be a part of if you want to communicate. It seems to me, from my perspective, that, instead of like, the world can still exist if Facebook isn't the place that everybody goes to. There could be 5 other Facebooks. And so that, you can go to the one that you're a little bit more suited to. We already, are in our own silos on these things anyways. So the idea that multiple ones would exist. Let me bounce this idea off you. I mean, there's multiple ways in which antitrust can be applied to these things. And usually has to do with separating the data of the users and the ability to sell that data or sell against that data, right? And sell advertising. We have about 4 or 5 minutes here, so I want to bounce this idea off you. What if there was no algorithm? Could we, under an antitrust, let's say, paradigm, could we say one of the things that we won't allow is an algorithm that feeds you content, right? Because the argument is that these things are platforms, not publishers. That's why they don't have the liability, because they're not actually publishing this content. They're just providing a platform for other people to publish it. But what does a publisher do? It seems to me makes editorial decisions. And the algorithm, which pushes you content, is basically an automated editor, isn't it? It's saying, this is the stuff that we're going to promote. This is how we're going to aggregate it for you, the user. Could you eliminate that algorithm so that everything is just swimming out there?
It's funny, whenever somebody proposes something like that, I always want to say, like, really? Are you sure you want an internet in which everything is swimming out there? Everybody who exists on Twitter has the experience of getting some weird spam message in your DMs or getting some message that is purporting to be from a real person, but is actually some kind of porn advertisement. I get one of those almost every day. And consider that that's just the tip of the iceberg. Those are just the ones that are getting through the filter currently.
Well, there's a difference between a filter and an algorithm that pushes stuff, right? I mean, like, I watch something on YouTube. YouTube is going to be pushing me content. And that's different from filtering out stuff that may be spam. And they're filtering me content because that's also going to make me a riper commodity for their sales.
Now you're, in my opinion, hitting on like one of the really important points here, is that when we're thinking about how to deal with the lack of competition in social media platforms, one, we frankly need some updates to antitrust law. One of the kind of limitations of antitrust law right now is that sort of the primary way that it contemplates consumer harm is price. And price isn't really what we're talking about when we're talking about the lack of competition in these platforms. We're talking about privacy. We're talking about, to take the current example of the Google Fitbit merger, we're talking about a company that exists by turning your data into advertising, suddenly being able to collate your data about your online behavior with your data about offline behavior, which brings a cost to consumers that doesn't necessarily just boil down to price.
Yes, and I have to say, on behalf of the many people we've had on to talk about antitrust, we don't need a change in the laws. We just simply need a different, a return to the way that we applied these laws prior to the 70s and the sort of Borkian shift that took place under Reagan. So we don't need actual change to the laws. We just need an attorney general and a Department of Justice that decides to apply the laws in the way that they were originally applied prior to the changes in disposition under the Reagan administration. I should just say that. I mean, that's
okay. Fair point. To your point about privacy, I also think that we need to think about more serious privacy legislation kind of in concert with the antitrust discussion. And this is, in my opinion, where the rubber really hits the road. Facebook endorsed SESTA FOSTA. Facebook is already signaling a kind of pre-endorsement of future changes to Section 230. Facebook and Twitter and Google will be the beneficiaries of future attempts to undermine Section 230, but you're not going to hear them endorse the kind of privacy protecting legislation that EFF endorses, where if they break the rules, then you have a private right of action. You can actually sue them and take them to court. You're not going to hear Facebook endorse that.
Elliot, we get about 30 seconds. What does Facebook think? They have a competitive advantage if 230 is applied because they'll have the ability to moderate stuff in a way that competitors won't? Why do they support it?
Right, because Facebook has, these gigantic staffs of people doing content moderation. They have the filters and algorithms and all of that stuff. They also have the legal cushion, right? Whenever something gets proposed, like, oh, what if we passed a bill that requires platforms to do such and such? There's a whole bunch of ways that law is going to need to be tested in court, and a startup is not going to have the budget to do it. I always point out, one, that Facebook endorsed SESTA, and two, right after SESTA passed, when multiple dating sites shut down, I think it was literally 3 weeks later, Facebook announced that it was starting a dating app.
There you go. Well, Elliot, I appreciate it. Folks can find out more by going to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.